Hello and welcome to Gardening at 58 North. So in this video I'd like to give you another yearly update of my bamboo plants. So this year they've grown so much and there's so many of them, I'm having to film this first intro section on my extra wide angle lens. So as you can see, they've all grown quite a lot. I don't think I've got any new species this year, but I have been propagating some of my previous plants, so I have got a greater number of bamboos. So what I'll do is I will film them individually so you can see them better. Normally I just have the two at the back here, the two timber Phyllostachys bamboos, and the rest of this area is quite free of bamboos, but I just like to put them here at the beginning so you can have a quick look at all the bamboos in one place at once. So what I'll do is I'll start with the Phyllostachys bamboos, which is the three at the back here. Then I will go on to some of my other bamboos. I've got my Fargesias down here. I've got my Chusquea gigantea in the corner, which as you can see has now doubled. I've got two of them. In fact, I've actually got 3 or 4 plants now, the way that I've propagated them. I'll also talk about this separated plant, which is a seedling of a Phyllostachys Edulis. This was actually at my parents' and I've just propagated some of it to do a few experiments. And then I've also got on the corner the borinda as well, which I introduced last year as a new bamboo. So first of all, I'd like to start off with my Phyllostachys bamboos. So when I'm talking about the bamboos this year, I'm going to focus less on the particular attributes of each species. Often, especially when I introduce a new bamboo, I'll talk about the species and how it's different to other ones. In this update and going forward with new updates, I'm going to try and focus more on the individual plants of mine and how they've done over the year, so that I'm not constantly repeating the same thing in every video. Although if I do get new species of bamboo, I will talk about their particular attributes and do an introductory videos to them. So these are my timber bamboos. These are normally permanently planted here. Well, there's only 2 that are permanently planted here. We have on the right hand side here Phyllostachys Edulis, the Moso bamboo that I grew from seed, and at the back here, which is really getting quite tall this year, we have the Phyllostachys aureosulcata Spectabilis. Now on the left hand side there is also a pot grown Phyllostachys bissetii. You can see down there, it's in the pot. That doesn't normally live here. I kind of move it around the garden, it doesn't have a permanent home yet. One day I might put it in a really large pot, or maybe somewhere with a root barrier. So I'll go through all these bamboos in a clockwise fashion and I'll just talk about how they've done over the last year. So first of all, there's my bissetii here. So this Phyllostachys bissetii, this has been a fairly new addition of mine. I only got it last summer. It wasn't looking too healthy, didn't have a lot of leaves, and it's basically been in the pot for too long. So I put it in a much larger pot, although even though this pot at the moment looks quite small for it, for the size of it, it was in a much smaller pot originally, and to be honest, it desperately does need a larger pot. So I'm hoping in the next year or so to get a larger pot and put it somewhere more permanently. I've just not found the space for it yet, and I'm just going to keep it in a smaller pot for now because I can move it around a lot more easily. So what this has done over the last year, hasn't gained any more height unfortunately. I think because it was so stressed last year in that tiny pot, it hasn't put any energy into upsizing. So what it has done is it sent up several new culms from the base, and it's got a lot bushier. Hasn't regressed in size, the whole clump, none of the top half has died off, but the new culms aren't any bigger, they're just more dense. So unfortunately, not any upsizing this year, just a healthier plant and a bushier plant. So hopefully next year, with it being healthier and it growing its rhizomes over this summer, it will grow into a larger plant next year, but we'll just have to wait and see. I did propagate a bit from this, so I'll pan down now and show you the propagated material I used. First of all, there's this one on the right hand side. This one's looking fairly good now. This was quite small when I propagated it. Basically, when I repotted this into its larger pot last summer, I took off a few pieces that broke off from the root ball and I just decided to put them in pots and see if they would propagate. So for example, this plant here, this was only one small shoot, and you can see now it's got lots of nice new shoots. So I'll show you the original shoot that was on this. The original shoot was just this one in the middle here. Hopefully it's visible enough, just that one there in the middle. It's now sent up 3 nice new shoots, which are looking quite good. It also had a very old shoot on the side, but that was really nothing much. So the new shoots are slightly larger than last year's, not much, but we got 4 times the amount of growth, so I'm quite happy with that. Reasonable upsizing, and it's in a decent sized pot for now. I'll probably keep this in this pot for another year or so. So this one here was actually more of an experiment. This one was just a little bit of rhizome that snapped off. There wasn't any upgrade culms or anything like that, and this rhizome was actually already sticking out the pot slightly. So the bit that was already sticking out the pot, I just kept that out the pot, and that's that section there. So it's put on a few little side shoots, a few leaves. It's just very weak at the moment. It's been sitting there all summer not really doing anything. It's not really had any leaves. I think it's probably focusing mostly on its roots, and hopefully next summer it's going to send up some culms and we'll get a lot more leaves on it. But it's certainly alive. The leaves look very healthy as well. It's just not doing very well. Very young plant. Hopefully, as I say, next spring send up some proper culms and then it will take off and then it will be growing like a normal bamboo plant. So I've moved my bissetii so it's easier to see my Phyllostachys aureosulcata Spectabilis. This is also known as Zoe groove bamboo. That's this nice large one here. This has always been the fastest and best growing bamboo for me. It's not surprising as well because it's the bamboo which is probably most suited to my climate, or at least out of all my running bamboos it is. So it doesn't mind the cooler summers, and also it's really hardy so it doesn't get really much damaged by the frosts. So bissetii is supposed to be slightly more tolerant than this one, but my bissetii is in the pot so it doesn't have the space it needs to really do this best, whereas this has. So this has now had 3 growing seasons in the ground, and as you can see it's really taking off and getting quite a big plant now. So most of last year's culms are not the upright ones, they're these lower down ones. So what tends to happen with me with this plant is in the first year it grows up these very tall culms, and then what happens is the second year those culms then produce a lot of leaves, and the weight of all those leaves tend to cause them to flop over, and that's why you get this much bushier appearance for the second and third year that the culms are alive for. So this is a natural thing that happens with a lot of bamboos anyway, but I think it's just exacerbated more for me because I've been giving this a really high nitrogen feed most summers and it's been producing a bit too many leaves. This year actually I've given it a lot less nitrogen and it's not quite as heavy with leaves as it has been in previous years, and I'm going into more of a phosphorus potassium feed over the summer to encourage more rhizomes and root growth. I'll go into that a bit more with my Phyllostachys Edulis, but basically I've just been following what most people recommend, which is a high nitrogen feed for most of the year, but this year I'm trying something different with a higher potassium feed. So it's done well, this one. Last year it was nowhere near this tall. It's probably gained an extra metre in height. It's now about 3 meters or just over 3 meters in height, so it's doing well. It's also bushed up a huge amount. You can see it's really wide now. In fact, I'm going to have to prune a little bit away from my Edulis on the right here because I'm a bit worried that might smother it, and that's going to take off too much and the Edulis is going to suffer because of that, especially as the Edulis isn't perfectly suited for my climate anyway. No signs of running yet on the Spectabilis bamboo. This is known to run quite freely in the UK. I haven't had any signs of that yet, but it's only the 3rd year in the ground. And to be honest, my climate is quite cold anyway, so I'm not expecting much running to occur from this until a few more years, or until we get a really hot summer again. Really happy with the growth of the Spectabilis. Really stocky, hardy plant. Very rarely gets any damage over winter. It does get flattened by the snow up here. We do get quite heavy snow at times. Last winter we had about 1.5 feet of snow at one point, and it completely flattened the plant, but it just sprang back up. Absolutely no damage at all. Very flexible canes, but they don't seem to snap very easily, so quite happy with that one. Also, this corner is a very windy corner. It gets blasted by the wind. Does get a bit of cold wind damage, but it's nothing too bad. The really cold weather, -15 or so, doesn't affect its foliage. It's absolutely fine with it. But I did find when I get some wind, even if it's just -1 or 2, it does get a little bit of damage on the leaves. This year was worse than most, but it wasn't too bad, as I say. The other problem I did have this year with the 2 Phyllostachys plants that I have here is I had a lot of bamboo aphid. I've never had bamboo aphid before, and all of a sudden I've had a massive outbreak of it. I'm not sure where it came from. There must just be bamboo aphid in this area now, but I don't think they're native to the UK, being quite specific for bamboo, so they must have been introduced at some point to the UK. So it was quite a bad outbreak at one point. The leaves were all really sticky, and every single leaf had about 5 or 6 aphids on it, or maybe even more on some of the leaves, and I was a bit worried it might sap a lot of the energy out of it. It didn't seem to affect it too badly, and after a few weeks the outbreak peaked and a lot of ladybirds and hoverfly larvae came in and cleared up all the aphids, so I wasn't too worried about that. Didn't give it any treatment and it's just cleared itself. So I think that's something that might happen periodically from now on my bamboo plants. Didn't really affect my other bamboos. A little bit on the Fargesia, lots on the 2 types of Phyllostachys, and I didn't notice any on the Chusquea gigantea or on the borinda either. It really just seemed to be mainly the Phyllostachys genus that it was attacking. So I'll see what it's like next year. I expect I will probably get outbreaks every year from now on as it's in the area, but I think hopefully what will happen is what happened this year. It starts to get bad and then all the beneficial insects come in and it just deals with it. So that's my Phyllostachys aureosulcata Spectabilis. doing really well. Hopefully it might start running next year, start filling the bed. To this bed, it goes behind the shed there on the left, and it's quite a long bed, probably about 2.5–3 meters long. It'll be nice for that to come across and create a bit of a screen. So I'll now talk about my Moso bamboo, which is this one on the right. So this here is my Moso bamboo, Phyllostachys Edulis. So it's done quite well this year. It hasn't got really any height gain, which is a bit of a shame. There was one culm which was quite a bit thicker than last year's culm, and it looked like it was going to be about 1 or 2 foot taller than last year's, and then it just got damaged in the wind. We had some strong winds as the culm was quite young and the top got snapped off, so it didn't get any taller than last year's, unfortunately. But it's a much bushier plant. So last year I think there was only about 2 or 3, maybe 4 culms that were this height. This year there's probably about 10 or 20 culms this height. It's sent up loads and loads of culms again this year, and it's staying a very tight clumper, but it is starting to show signs that it might be going to its more mature phase. So you can see down the bottom here, there's a culm there with much smaller leaves, and a lot of the newer culms as well, the leaves tend to be a little bit smaller than they were in the previous years. So I'm hoping this will upsize soon to a mature Moso bamboo. Moso bamboo, as I said previously, isn't really well suited for my climate. It likes a much hotter summer. Although it doesn't mind the cold winters, it really needs that hot summer to get into a mature phase and grow into a giant plant. So it may stay as a juvenile form for me. Basically the juvenile form is lots of small culms in a tight clumping base, which is actually quite desirable for bamboo if you don't want it to spread. But I want it to be a massive giant timber bamboo, so I have got it in rhizome barrier to keep it contained. So I'm hoping that this will start to become a runner at some point. I'm making a video, it's going to take me about 2 or 3 years to complete, where I'm looking at scientific journals online, seeing what they say, and trying a few experiments on my own to see if I can trigger it into running. Now I'm already pushing the boundaries with this plant because this isn't supposed to do well in the UK at all, and it only grows well really in Cornwall or Somerset. I'm in North Scotland, one of the coldest places in the UK, and it's growing very well for me, and it's very healthy. Admittedly, it's not upsizing into a giant plant yet, but I'm going to try a few different techniques and see if I can actually get it to upsize into a giant timber bamboo in a climate that's completely away from what it should be able to do that in. So the main things I'm going to be looking for, I won't go into all the details in this video, but I'll be trying to increase the soil temperature to get the rhizomes to form, and I'll be using more potassium and phosphorus feed. So the idea is, in spring you give it a lot of nitrogen feed, and that's good for when it comes up with the new culms and it's growing lots of new leaves. Then from midsummer onwards, you want it to focus its energy onto the roots and the rhizomes, because you want it to store that energy in the rhizomes for next spring for making the giant culms and the massive new shoots that will come up. So if you give it a high nitrogen feed throughout the whole summer, it's going to grow loads and loads of leaves. And as you can see, a plant like this, there's so many leaves, they just kind of shade themselves out. You don't need any more leaves, it's already got far more than it needs. So if it produces more leaves at the moment, it's just going to be heavier culms, they're going to sag down more, and it's not going to get a lot more photosynthesis. Whereas if I focus on the potassium and phosphorus, all that energy that it's gathering from the sun right now, instead of making new leaves with it, hopefully it will put it into its root system and its rhizome formation. So talking of trying out these new growing techniques, I have one down here, which is another Phyllostachys Edulis. So originally when I grew these plants from seed, it was about 4 years ago, and what happened is I had 2 seedlings that came up. One of them I planted in my parents' garden, just put it in a normal garden bed, didn't give it any special attention, and it's kind of sat there about 2 foot in height, hasn't really grown at all. If anything, it shrank down for the first 2 years. It's only recently that it's starting to get a bit of upsizing to it, but it's still only about 2 foot tall. The other plant was this one at the back here, which I put in my garden, and I've given it the absolute perfect conditions I can with feed and compost and watering, and it's thrived and done really well. So the one down here is a division from the one at my parents' garden. The first year I put it in the ground, it got really dry, it got desiccated, lost all its leaves, almost died, and the clump kind of regressed. As it regressed, it became almost like 2 clumps, so it was quite easy for me to divide it. I took this section out in spring, it was quite small. The idea with this is I'm going to try and force this into a mature plant using the high temperatures and the feed regime that I spoke of previously, and so far it's working quite well. I've got running rhizomes on this, which I don't have in any of the outside planted Phyllostachys plants, so it definitely shows, it seems anyway, at the beginning of the trial that I'm doing, it does seem to be that the key thing is the high temperatures in the soil to initiate that rhizome formation. So this one has nice running rhizomes right now. Also, it hasn't done what the other ones have done, which was a particular problem with the one at the back here, is shoot production throughout the summertime, which is what you don't want. What you want is the culms to come up at the beginning of the year, and then over the summer you want it to focus energy into new roots and rhizomes instead of sending up new shoots, because instead of storing the energy, if it's sending up lots of shoots throughout the whole summer, it's not going to have all that energy stored for the giant culms next spring. So that's the problem with the one at the back. It's sending up culms constantly throughout the summer. It's not storing that energy, so it's sending up lots of little things, not one or two giant culms. The idea with this one at the bottom is hopefully I've focused it so much onto rhizome formation, and it definitely has done that because there's been no new shoots coming up, but hopefully next spring it's going to have all that energy stored and it's going to send up some new culms that are fewer in number but much greater in size. So we'll see how it does. You can see this one is still more of a juvenile phase than the one at the back. It's got overarching stems and they've got quite large leaves. Part of the reason the culms are quite loose is because this has been in my conservatory without any wind and lower light levels, so the culms are a little bit weaker because of that, but it's also because it's more in the juvenile phase and it doesn't have the more mature culms like the one at the back is starting to show. So all in all, they're doing quite well. The one at the back, I say, is looking particularly good right now. Really healthy, really bushy, but it's still got that bit of an issue of sending up culms throughout the whole summer. Now this summer has been quite cold, so it's really been against me, the weather, for trying to get it into rhizome production. I don't believe I have had any rhizome production, or if I have, it's been very limited and I haven't been able to find any near the surface. But what I have noticed is I have managed to inhibit some of that really late growth that I often get. So normally when I'm doing these update videos, what I found in the autumn time is shooting up some quite large culms, and they haven't leafed out yet, and then the frost hits them. Whereas this year it hasn't done that. It has set up a few new culms throughout the summer, but it kind of stopped around August time when we had some warmer weather, and it hasn't restarted again. So I'm hoping with that energy focusing more on its root system and storing the energy instead of constantly using that excess energy to grow new culms, that next spring we should get good upsizing with this. Certainly this year there was no real upsizing in the height or the culm width. There's only one or two culms that were really much thicker than last year, but we have got a really bushy healthy plant now, so it should have a lot of energy reserves hopefully. And with Phyllostachys Edulis, although it's like most running bamboos that it stores most of its energy in its rhizomes, it stores a much higher percentage of its overall energy in its culms than most of them. So having lots of culms is a good thing. It's a larger energy store, so hopefully with all these culms and potentially one or two rhizomes forming, next spring we'll get a good upsizing. I'm not expecting a doubling in height because I'm not in the perfect growing environment for it, but hopefully maybe another metre or two in height. That would be great. At the moment it's just under 2 meters in height, so maybe next year a 3 meter culm would be a nice surprise. So that's it for the Phyllostachys bamboos. I'll now go ahead and I'll show you some of my others. So these are my 3 Fargesia plants. So there's 2 different varieties, and the small one at the bottom here is just a propagated section of the one on the right. So I've never been too sure what species these are. These came from a flowering plant back in 2015, so they're about 9 years old now. So I collected this from a bamboo that was about 3 meters in height. It's definitely a Fargesia, but I wasn't sure what variety. So I've tried to figure it out, and I've looked on some online forums, and it doesn't quite fit correctly for one or the other, so it's probably a hybrid between murielae and nitida. It could be a murielae or it could be a nitida, but it's most likely a hybrid between the two, and they've both got varying features of them. So the one on the right, it grows quite differently to the one on the left. The one on the right, it tends to stay quite small. It's also extremely deciduous in winter. The one on the left is also deciduous, but not to the same extent. You can see they're just starting to take on their autumn colours now, starting to go yellow. They tend to go very yellow at this time of year and then drop about 80% of their leaves. They still are evergreen over winter, and because they have so many leaves, even if they drop 70 or 80%, there's still plenty of leaf on the plant, but it just looks quite dramatic at this time of year when all of a sudden loads of leaves start to drop. So the one on the right has stayed small for the whole time and has lots of small culms. It is upsizing, but it's much slower, and the culms are much more numerous and quite weak. They're also not much of a colour to them. They tend to be quite a pale green colour, whereas the one on the left, it's got some interesting leaf sheaths, and the leaf sheaths are quite a nice dark kind of purpley colour. Also, what's nice to see on the one on the left is it's upsizing nicely, so you can see there's a lot of dead down below. That's a lot of the old culms and the old side branches dying off, and it's self-thinning, and so each year it's actually growing less culms, but the culms that it is growing are much thicker and taller as well, so it's upsizing nicely, and at this stage it it really needs to be going into the ground because I think it's limited now by the pot size. Another nice feature of the culms on this one on the left is they often have a waxy covering, and that's often a bit of a turquoisey blue colour, so there's a potential that this could be a blue stemmed bamboo when it's older. If it develops more of that waxy culm as it grows up, it might look more like some of the borindas and have that nice blue colour to it. So we'll see how this one develops. This one has the most potential, the one on the left. It looks like it'll be a decent size, hopefully 3 or 4 meters in height, a tight clumper with nice looking culms with potentially blue culms. The one on the right is probably going to be a dwarf type bamboo. I can't imagine it growing much more than 2 meters, but what I'm going to do with these soon is I'm going to be planting them in the ground. I think now they've had too long in the pot. What I need to do is propagate them so I can keep some in the pot, so I can keep them propagated and moved around if I want to, and the rest of the plant I'm probably going to put in the ground somewhere, let it grow to its full size, because I really want to see how big this gets. So I don't know if I'll do that this year or maybe 2 or 3 years time, but that's something I definitely want to do with these soon, because they're now restricted by the pot size, and if I get them much bigger pots it's going to be difficult to move them around. And as they are clumping bamboos, I don't need them in a root barrier or in a pot. They're not going to spread too much and become a problem. So they're doing quite well. They're always very slow growing though. They don't upsize very quickly. Compared with the Phyllostachys anyway, they're very slow plants to upsize. But I am happy with the growth in general. So that's it for the Fargesias. I'll now show you something that's quite closely related to the Fargesias, and that's my borinda. So this here is my borinda, a much rarer type of bamboo. This one is probably a borinda papyrifera, and the collection number is KR6438. They've all got different collection numbers because the species aren't fully defined yet, so they're not too sure what classifications they're going to be in. But this is the 6438 borinda. This one has done quite well for me. I'm quite happy with how it's looking. This should get to several meters in height eventually, and it's definitely upsizing well. So last year it was quite small, thin stems. This year getting some much thicker culms and a much greater height. Interestingly, it's not a very leafy bamboo, so I wouldn't use this as a barrier bamboo. It's got quite big culms, but for the size of the culms there's not that many side branches and there's not that many leaves, so it hasn't got that dense canopy that you want if you want screening. But what's nice about it is it's going to have those blue culms eventually. There's a little bit of a hint just starting to come through now with some of the larger ones, but it's still going to be a few years off until I get the proper blue culms on this plant. It needs to be at least probably 5 years old to get a good blue culm starting to develop on it. So the culms themselves do seem surprisingly weak. I've had a few of them snap by accident. They're very flimsy culms as well. Even though this has been grown outside, it tends to get quite damaged by the wind, and the wind moves it around an awful lot. Also, it doesn't like too much bright light, so I keep this in a fairly sheltered, shady position. It does get some direct sunshine. I don't have any midday sun on it, otherwise it will go a bit yellow. And it's very winter deciduous as well. In fact, this one is a bit less hardy than my other bamboos. It is hardy to my area, but its leaves will just completely drop anything below about -5, I find. So we had minus, I think, 12 last year, and it had a huge amount of damage. None of my other bamboos got damaged by the frosts, just by the wind damage. This one got damaged by the frosts, and it lost all of its leaves completely, but the culms were absolutely fine. So although it looked terrible over winter and it just about looked dead, it grew lots of new leaves in spring and new culms, and it wasn't too phased by it. So although it lost all its leaves over winter, it was quite happy, and it still had a lot of energy reserves to upsize nicely this spring. Whereas some other bamboos, if they lose all their leaves over winter, they often get hit quite hard, and they actually regress slightly with their new culms, and they tend to be smaller than the previous years. So I'm quite happy with how it's done. I will probably need to repot it next year, as it's getting quite large for its pot now. And as a clumping bamboo, I can put this in the garden and not worry about it running. It is a fairly widely spaced clumping bamboo, and it's already showing characteristics of that already. So the new culms are coming up about 5-10 centimeters away from the main plant, and that's probably going to increase to about 1 foot in distance as it gets older. So a fairly fast spreading clumping bamboo, but definitely not a running bamboo. So quite happy with it, as I say. I'm going to find a nice spot for it in my garden. It should get to a decent size as well. It's just a shame that over winter I'm not going to have that nice evergreen foliage, and it's going to look quite ugly and going to be quite bare of leaves. But as I say, quite happy with how it's done, and we'll see how it does over this winter. I expect a similar thing to happen with the leaves falling off, but hopefully as it matures there is a chance that it could get a bit tougher and hardier, might get more used to my climate, and might be a little bit more evergreen over the winters. So the last species of bamboo I'd like to show you are my Chusquea gigantea here. So last year I only had the one, this year you can see I have two. That's because I just split this into 2 plants with a spade, basically cut the old plant in half, put it into new pots, and despite splitting it in half, each plant now is bigger than last year's plant, so it's definitely upsized quite well. You can see height wise hasn't got much taller. There is a little bit of upsizing with the height, and the culms are definitely thicker, but with me separating it into 2 plants, I've definitely weakened it a little bit, so we're not getting that rapid upsize that I could have got potentially if I had left it in a larger pot. So I'm going to make a propagation video about this soon, and there's actually 1 or 2 little other plants I've propagated from this. Chusquea gigantea is very hard to propagate, so I definitely want to keep 1 or 2 small ones in pots if I can and propagate them, because once they become a mature plant, they're very difficult to propagate. So this has done well over the last year, and to say I propagated it in spring, and it wasn't looking 100% then, because in wintertime this does lose a fair few leaves, but it's grown quite well since. It's greened up very nicely and put up lots of new culms. So the new culms are looking pretty big, and I've looked underneath the soil in the pot, and underneath the ground there's some nice new culms starting to form for next spring. This tends to often send up the culms kind of autumn time, I find. They don't seem to get hit by the frost in winter, and then they fully develop in the springtime. I'm not sure why that happens with this species. The new culms for next spring look a really good size. It's now getting to the stage I'm going to have to put this in a very large pot or in the ground to really get it to get any bigger, because it's really getting confined by the size of its pot now. So hopefully next year the plan is to plant some of these bamboos in my garden. Certainly the Chusquea gigantea, I'd like to get that in the ground soon, get it upsizing. One of them I'll put in my parents' garden. It should be quite wind resistant and good in a salty area, whereas most bamboos don't tolerate salt winds so well. This one's supposed to be a little bit tougher, so I'm going to put this in my parents' garden where it's coastal, and this will be replacing a large conifer, so hopefully this will provide a nice bit of screening like the conifer used to do, and a bit of a windbreak as well. So I'll document that when that happens. Hopefully we'll get some good upsizing with it being in the soil. But that's about it for this video. Bamboos are doing quite well at the moment. A little bit of upsizing this year, but it's not been a huge amount. This summer though wasn't a very hot summer, and last summer was very dry, so I think that's part of the reason. So this year we had a very cool June and July, which really set back the bamboos. The bamboos started off really well though, because we had a very warm May. In fact, it was exceptionally hot, and it was just about the hottest month of the year, and that got the culms shooting up a bit earlier than normal. So we started off really well, really strong, and then we got a really cold June, quite a cool July, and August wasn't great either, even though it was close to average temperatures. So quite a cool summer in general. So the culms didn't reach a huge height, even though some of the diameters were slightly larger than the previous years. And with that cooler summer temperatures, I think, as I say, there is a chance that they won't be upsizing a huge amount next year, but it hasn't been dry this summer, which is good, and bamboos like a lot of water, so hopefully we'll get some reasonable upsizing, and the plants do look very healthy going into the winter. So we'll just see what the winter brings. Hopefully next year we've got some good upsizing, and I'll see you in a year's time with the update. Between now and then there might be 1 or 2 bamboo updates on individual plants, such as the Chusquea gigantea propagation, and if I get around to it, I'll hopefully be planting some of these in the garden as well.